The house held its breath when a scream split the midnight hallway, and the narrator felt the old walls flinch. Ava Carter whispered, "Someone opened the study," and her voice shook like brittle glass. Victor Hale said it was the wind, but the latch mark on the door gleamed new. Lena Brooks said, "Don't go in there," yet her hands were already searching her coat for a key. Ethan Park tried to joke and failed, as the silence swallowed the echo. Michael Carter stood at the stairs, and the shame on his face moved like a shadow. The narrator traced the smell of cold rain and dust, and the storm drummed a hard rhythm on the roof. Ava said, "The ledger was hidden behind the oak panel, and the hallway clock answered with a heavy tick." Victor said, "Stories make cowards brave," and his smile was polished steel. Michael said, "Leave it buried," and the plea scraped the air thin. Lena said, "Open the panel," and the key met wood with a nervous clink. The narrator felt the house recoil as the panels slid, and paper bruised by time exposed a secret that breathed. Morning bruised the sky, and the house pretended it had not heard the night. Ava said, "These entries skip entire years," and her finger traced gaps that felt like wounds. Victor said, "Old bookkeeping wanders," and he poured coffee that smelled like cover. Lena said, "The ink changes tone after this page, and the observation tasted of risk." Ethan said, "If this were a movie we would run," and the joke tried to stand but sank. Michael watched the kitchen clock grind its slow ring and searched the floor for an answer. The narrator counted the ways silence becomes a lock, and each click was shaped like a memory. Ava said, "Someone paid a debt that never ends," and the ledger stared back like a kept animal. Victor said, "Close it," and the steam from the cup fogged the air like a veil. The table held everyone's weight, and the wood complained softly. Lena said, "There is a name hidden in the margin," and the name refused to be heard. The study smelled of wool, dust, and withheld truth, and the narrator mapped a path through its careful order. Ava said, "This panel hides more than shelves," and she pressed along the molding forgive. Victor said, "Curiosity ruins families," and the sentence landed like a velvet hammer. Lena said, "Then the family was fragile already," and she tested the baseboard with a steady heel. Ethan said, "If an alarm screams, we blame the cat," and his grin returned with borrowed courage. Michael drifted near the window, and the rain rehearsed an old confession. Ava said, "Look at this ledger edge, it's darker here," and she angled the lamp to pull out faint numbers. Victor said, "Artifacts belong where they rest," and the lamp's chain tinkled like a warning bell. The narrator felt the air grow denser, as if the room remembered a fight. Lena said, "There's a hidden hinge behind the map," and the map began to look like a mask. The ledger yielded a receipt that smelled of smoke and sea, and the paper hissed when unfolded. Ava said, "This signature matches a trust account," and the trust felt like a staged smile. Victor said, "Coincidence is the mother of panic," and he tapped the desk twice, soft and precise. Lena said, "The same initials appear on the property deed," and her voice lowered to meet the floorboards. Ethan said, "Property near the coast," and a map pin seemed to glow where storms like to sit. Michael said, "Burn it," and the word arrived late and afraid. The narrator watched the room tilt toward a choice, and every breath sounded like a hinge. Ava said, "We finish what began last night," and resolve made her shoulders square. Victor said, "You will regret daylight," and the window brightened in defiance. The silence that followed had a shape, and it looked like a door finally opening. The foyer gathered them like witnesses, and the narrator counted the echoes. Ava said, "We visit the address on the deed," and the words drew a line no one could step over. Victor said, "I will make the call," and the phone in his pocket felt like a leash. Lena said, "No more calls," and she held the keys as if they weighed the truth. Ethan said, "Road snacks and terrible music," and a small laugh survived the draft. Michael said, "If you open that place, you open me," and the confession hovered like mist. The storm thinned to a whisper, and the house loosened its careful jaw. Ava said, "Then we open it together," and the door latch clicked like a verdict. Victor said, "Remember who pays your silence," and the stair runner swallowed the threat. The narrator saw the day lean forward, and the future felt sharp and cold. They stepped into it, and the house watched them leave. The road stretched out beneath a gray dawn, and the narrator said the silence in the car was heavier than the storm. Ava said, "Every gap in the ledger feels like missing years of my life," and her knuckles whitened around the worn map. Victor said, "Missing years mean nothing when the present is intact," and his gaze never strayed from the wet asphalt. Lena said the ink wasn't random, someone wanted this hidden, and her voice carried the weight of unfinished truth. Ethan said, "I'd rather we chase ghosts than stay trapped," and his laugh tried to erase the tension. Michael sat in the back, staring at his own reflection, and regret deepened the creases around his eyes. The narrator said the journey felt like driving through memories not yet lived. Ava said, "If we don't face it, it will swallow us," and her words felt sharp against the mist. Victor said family survives through silence, but the echo suggested something else. The roadside diner flickered neon against the morning haze, and the narrator said it looked like a place for forgotten truths. Ava said, "These numbers point to land we never knew," and her finger tapped the edge of the receipt. Victor said, "Stop digging before the ground caves in," and he stirred his coffee until it went cold. Lena said, "Caves are carved by water that never gives up," and her words fell quietly. Ethan said, "At least the pie here survives the years," and the laughter caught halfway before breaking. Michael traced the rim of his mug, and his silence was louder than the jukebox humming. The narrator said the light hummed too, making every detail tremble like nerves. Ava said, "We are already in the collapse," and her shoulders squared. Victor said, "Then I will not fall with you," and the words cut as if rehearsed. The old courthouse loomed, stone gray against a cloud-swept noon, and the narrator said history clung to its walls. Ava said, "These deeds are registered here," and her voice carried defiance. Victor said, "Only fools challenge what is written in stone," and his shoes echoed too sharply. Lena said stone cracks faster than people think, and her fingertips brushed the carved banisters. Ethan said, "Feels like walking into a crime scene," and the joke sat heavy in the chamber air. Michael looked at the plaque of names, and his breath trembled. The narrator said even the walls held back secrets waiting for ears. Ava said, "Truth survives ink and stone," and her grip on the folder hardened. Victor said, "And lies survive longer," and the hall swallowed the words whole. In the records room, dust swam in shafts of light, and the narrator said the files breathed like ghosts. Ava said, "This is the missing year," and her hand trembled on the brittle page. Victor said, "It proves nothing," and the denial cracked. Lena said, "It proves someone erased too much," and her whisper cut deeper. Ethan said, "If we vanish next, at least history will laugh," and his grin collapsed quickly. Michael said, "I signed one of these papers," and guilt spread across the silence. The narrator said the page had weight heavier than stone, pressing on every chest. Ava said, "It ties us to the coast," and resolve grew in her tone. Victor said, "End this before it consumes you," but the words came hollow. The courthouse steps groaned beneath their weight, and the narrator said the truth had followed them out into daylight. Ava said, "We go to the coast property," and her voice locked like a verdict. Victor said, "You risk more than you know," and his shadow stretched long. Lena said, "Risk is the only road forward," and her eyes caught the wind. Ethan said, "Then I'm driving because no one else trusts the map," and the laugh softened tension for a moment. Michael said, "That place is more grave than home," and sorrow bent his frame. The narrator said daylight could not wash away the ink of betrayal, and it clung to every step they took. Ava said, "Then we bury lies with light," and her eyes burned clear. Victor said light blinds as much as it reveals, and the crowd passing by ignored the storm forming at their feet. The coast air bit like truth, and the narrator felt the house refuse their footsteps. Ava said records list this parcel, yet the registry shows gaps, and her breath fogged. Victor said, "Clerks misfile when storms drown paper," and his tone sounded rehearsed. Lena said, misfiles do not repeat the same month for years, and she drew a line in dust. Ethan said, if ghosts live here, they file better than the county, and his smile wobbled. Michael touched the doorframe and looked away from the peeling paint. Wow. The ocean hammered the bluff and timed their hearts. Ava said, we open every room, and the phrase felt like a vow. Victor said, open one lie and 10 will follow, and the wind carried it thin. Lena said, then we count to 10, and her shoulders squared. The narrator heard floorboards speak names that no one wanted. Ethan said, I will check the cellar, and bravado slipped as the latch groaned. The cellar smelled of brine and iron, and the narrator swore the dark held its own ledger. Ava said, these boxes are numbered, then jumped to nowhere, and she knelt by a crate. Victor said, moisture ruins ink, not memory, and he stayed on the stair. Lena said, memory chooses what to keep, and she eased a lid aside. Ethan said, I hate this light, and a single bulb buzzed like a trapped fly. Michael said, I came here once, and the sentence collapsed under weight. Ava said, once when, and the pause scraped. Victor said, we are wasting daylight, and his heel tapped a warning on wood. Lena said, he brought you, and her eyes cut to Michael. Ethan said, there's a ledger copy, and his voice thinned. The narrator tasted rust as silence changed shape. Michael said, not today, and the bulb flickered as if it understood. By evening, town screens blinked with a tidy story, and the narrator heard spin click into place. Ava said, missing documents equal clerical noise, and she read the headline twice. Victor said, people need calm, not chaos, and his posture softened for cameras that were not here. Lena said, someone fed that line, and her jaw tightened. Ethan said, look at the timestamp, it posted before we left the courthouse, and his finger trembled. Michael said, power writes first, and the words tasted of old fear. Ava said, then we answer first, and the glow lit her face sharp. Victor said, answering invites ruin, and his voice became velvet again. Lena said, silence is already ruin, and her eyes refused to blink. The narrator felt the town hold its breath as if paid to wait. Ethan said, we need proof the public cannot ignore, and the screen dimmed on cue. They met behind the bait shop, where the narrator said truth smelled like rope and rain. Ava said, you called this parcel a transfer station, and the contact flinched in the dark. Victor said, walk away, and a gull shrieked like a deadline. Lena said, who signed the yearly renewals, and she held the receipt flat. Ethan said, your hands are shaking, and the contact wiped a sleeve. Michael said, I should have known, and the sentence broke. The contact said, the names rotate to hide the spine, and the hush grew heavy. Ava said, name the spine, and the tide slapped the pilings. Victor said, we are finished, and he reached for the paper. Lena said, say it, and the contact whispered a name that bent the night. The narrator felt the pier lean, as if the sea recoiled. Morning returned mean and bright, and the narrator said warnings travel faster than evidence. Ava said, they will bury us under process, and she stacked copies in a neat wall. Victor said, this is your last chance to be loyal, and fatigue showed at the edges. Lena said, loyal to what? And the syllables clicked like locks. Ethan said, I got an anonymous text saying stop or break, and his laugh died. Michael said, they always warn before they cut, and his eyes would not hold. Ava said, we publish everything at once, and the decision cleared the room. Victor said, you cannot win, and it sounded like prayer. Lena said, winning is not the point, and resolve set her mouth. The narrator felt the day tilt toward something sharp. Ethan said, then let it cut us honest, and the clock refused to slow. The storm calmed to drizzle, and the narrator said discovery cuts like broken glass. Ava said, this signature is Michael's, and her voice sliced the quiet. Victor said, he signed nothing of meaning, but the paper trembled between his fingers. Lena said, The ink matches the hidden ledger, and her words weighed like anchors. Ethan said, "You always said accidents never explained themselves," and his grin faded. Michael said, "I was forced," but the confession bent under its own weight. The narrator felt the room recoil like a body struck. Ava said, "You chose silence, not chains," and her stare did not move. Victor said, "He protected you," and his tone curved sharp. Michael said, "I destroyed more than I saved," and the truth bled out. The narrator said rain against glass could not cover the sound of trust breaking. Night fell heavy, and the narrator said, "Guilt never needed permission to return." Ava said, "What else hides under your name?" and her fists pressed the table edge. Michael said, "Deeds, deaths, and one death," and his whisper cracked. Victor said, "Do not listen," and his shadow grew long in lamplight. Lena said, "You already confessed the part you fear most," and she leaned closer. Ethan said, "Death is not a detail," and his tone lost its humor. The narrator said silence carried grief like a second language. Ava said, "Whose life ended for your survival," and her voice carved the air. Michael said, "Your mother's accident was not chance," and his eyes broke. Victor said, "He lies to free himself," but the denial trembled. The narrator said walls remembered too, holding back screams from years ago. The narrator said loyalty bent under weight, and laughter vanished from the corners. Ava said, "Stand with us or stand against us," and her breath frosted the cold glass. Victor said, "Family does not fracture unless someone pushes," and his voice cracked steel. Lena said, "Truth itself is the push," and her words cut quiet. Ethan said, "I trusted you, Victor," and his face paled with betrayal. Michael said, "We all trusted him," and the sorrow was shared. The narrator said the air split with tension sharp as wire. Ava said, "Tell us who owns the property deeds," and her demand was fire. Victor said, "My silence is your survival," and his face masked fury. Lena said, "Your silence is your weapon," and the line struck clean. The narrator said a house once safe, now echoed like a battlefield. The narrator said trust cracked like thin ice, and the echo stung deeper than words. Ava said, "You held back from me," and her tone cut Lena raw. Lena said, "I thought I was protecting you," and her hands shook. Victor said, "Even allies crumble," and his grin surfaced. Ethan said, "She kept pages," and he thrust the folder forward. Lena said, "I waited for the moment you were ready," and her eyes burned. Michael said, "Secrets rot slower than flesh," and the line sank heavy. The narrator said betrayal wore many faces, but the closest one always hurt most. Ava said, "You were my anchor," and anger bent her voice. Lena said, "I am still standing here," but her certainty faltered. Victor said, "She betrayed you first," and his words echoed like poison. The narrator said shadows stretched longer when the truth grew near. Ava said, "The deeds belong to someone we haven't seen," and her eyes narrowed. Victor said, "Names on paper lie," but his voice trembled faintly. Lena said, "This name repeats across 5 accounts," and she laid the copy flat. Ethan said, "It's hidden in plain sight," and his chest heaved. Michael said, "I knew the pattern," and the admission felt like a wound. The narrator said, "Revelation broke like glass shards scattered across silence." Ava said, "The hidden hand is real," and her words carried steel. Victor said, "You do not understand the cost," but sweat traced his temple. Lena said, "Then we meet the shadow," and resolve filled her tone. The narrator said the room tightened as if bracing for a storm waiting to be named. The narrator said the house held its breath as the ledger's twin copy appeared. Ava said, "This account links you and Victor," and her words cracked the silence. Michael said, "I signed nothing twice," but the paper screamed otherwise. Lena said, "These transactions repeat under different names," and her eyes sharpened. Ethan said, "Numbers don't lie, even when people do," and his voice dropped. Victor said, "Forgery is easy," and his smile cut like ice. Ava said, Forgery doesn't match your signature curve, and her finger traced the ink. Michael said, I thought I was saving us, and his voice crumbled. The narrator said the room felt like a trial, the air too heavy to breathe. Victor said, destroy it now, and his command echoed like a gavel. Ava said, this is the spine of the truth, and resolve lit her face. The narrator said trust crumbled when the Allah's mask slipped. Ava said, you knew all along, and her voice was fire. Lena said, I carried pieces to protect you, but the lie cracked open. Victor said she worked both sides, and his grin widened. Ethan said, you hid the deeds from us, and betrayal shook his tone. Michael said, you were meant to guard her, and sorrow wrapped his words. The narrator said silence, slice sharper than blades. Ava said, you let me chase shadows while you held the truth, and her hand shook. Lena said, I thought timing mattered more than honesty, and her eyes brimmed. Victor said, even her loyalty belongs to me, and arrogance spilled. The narrator said the storm outside grew louder, answering their fracture. The narrator said shadows retreated when the hidden hand showed. Ava said this name repeats across all accounts, and the silence stiffened. Victor said, names mean nothing without faces, but fear flickered. Lena said, the initials belong to you, and her voice sharpened. Ethan said, you played both savior and thief, and his words carried weight. Michael said, you pulled the strings, not me, and despair bled. The narrator said revelations slammed like thunder across the walls. Ava said, you are the architect of this betrayal, and her tone did not falter. Victor said, control is survival, but his mask cracked. Lena said control ends tonight, and the storm echoed her line. The narrator said the truth no longer whispered but screamed. The narrator said the mask fell when Victor and the shadow became one. Ava said every trail leads back to you, and her voice did not tremble. Victor said, I built this family from ruin, and rage cracked his calm. Lena said, you built it on graves, and her tone cut steel. Ethan said, all the missing years were your cover, and his jaw clenched. Michael said, I obeyed you because I was weak, and shame dragged him down. The narrator said the storm outside rattled chains long buried. Ava said, we face you now in daylight, though night pressed hard. Victor said, daylight burns liars and dreamers alike, and he straightened. The narrator said truth and power collided, and sparks flew between every stare. The narrator said choice carved the room into silence. Ava said, we release it all, and her words struck like lightning. Victor said, you will tear this family apart, but his eyes pleaded. Lena said, the family was already broken, and her hand closed the file. Ethan said, better truth than rot, and his voice steadied. Michael said, let it end here, and his shoulders collapsed. The narrator said finality hummed in the floorboards. Ava said, no turning back, and her stance hardened. Victor said, then you inherit ashes, and his words carried venom. Lena said, ashes grow stronger things, and her eyes did not waver. The narrator said the storm broke above them, thunder answering the verdict. The narrator said evidence weighed heavier than stone when Ava spread the final files. Ava said, every payment ties back to him, and her voice trembled with fire. Victor said, you twist shadows into shapes, and his fists curled tight. Lena said, shadows cannot forge bank stamps, and she shoved the copies forward. Ethan said, this is enough to burn everything, and resolve sharpened his tone. Michael said, it was never supposed to reach this day, and his head sank. The narrator said the storm outside turned witness, thunder marking every word. Ava said, we bring this to the council tonight, and determination burned. Victor said, the council bends to me, and pride cracked his facade. Lena said, not when the papers are public, and her glare was iron. The narrator said, lies had no more rooms left to hide in. The narrator said truth burned brighter under pressure when the family gathered in the hall. Ava said, hear what has been hidden, and her voice cracked through silence. Victor said, "This is fabrication," and he rose like a tower. Lena said, "The ink carries dates your memory cannot change," and her words cut cold. Ethan said, "People deserve to see the truth," and he raised his voice. Michael said, "I signed to protect, but it destroyed instead," and shame shook his breath. The narrator said faces around them sharpened like knives as witnesses leaned closer. Ava said, "Your empire collapses in daylight," and her glare did not break. Victor said, "You will regret exposing me," and rage slipped. Lena said, "Regret already lived here," and the words sealed. The narrator said judgment filled the air like a verdict waiting. The narrator said redemption came late when Michael stepped forward. Ava said, "Do not carry this alone," and her hand hovered near him. Michael said, "I was his shield, but shields break," and his eyes glistened. Victor said, "Cowardice dressed as sacrifice," and venom curled his words. Lena said, "He admits what you never would," and her gaze was steady. Ethan said, "A confession matters more than silence," and conviction shook his chest. The narrator said the hall trembled as the truth walked out of shadows. Michael said, "I signed to cover debts, but those debts were yours," and his words carried weight. Victor said, "Lies from the weak," but his tone cracked. Ava said, "You chained us all," and her voice split the air. The narrator said the crowd's silence pressed like thunder. The narrator said confrontation reached its peak when Ava faced Victor. Ava said, "You are the betrayal carved into every page," and her eyes burned. Victor said, "I kept you alive," and his voice cracked. Lena said, "Alive is not free," and her words struck. Ethan said, "Freedom comes with pain," and his tone rang true. Michael said, "You made me complicit," and guilt bent his shoulders. The narrator said the air grew electric, every breath sparking fire. Ava said, "You will answer now," and her fist slammed the table. Victor said, "I answer to no one," but his gaze flickered. Lena said, "Tonight, you answer to all," and her glare flamed. The narrator said the storm outside broke into lightning, illuminating every truth inside. The narrator said downfall came swiftly when lies collapsed on their maker. Ava said, "The documents are signed, the witness is here," and her voice steadied. Victor said, "You betray me," but fear cracked his mask. Lena said, "You betrayed first," and her words rang. Ethan said, "Power no longer shields you," and his tone struck sharp. Michael said, "Your grip ends tonight," and relief washed his face. The narrator said silence held for a breath before breaking into whispers. Ava said, "The council sees you as you are," and her eyes did not blink. Victor said, "I built this family," but his voice faltered. Lena said, "You buried it," and finality hit. The narrator said thunder roared one last time, sealing the reckoning. The narrator said the council chamber emptied like lungs after a scream, leaving only the echo of truth. Ava said, "We are no longer bound by his shadow," and her eyes softened. Victor said nothing, his silence loud as collapse. Lena said, "The records stand even without our voices," and her tone steadied. Ethan said, "What remains is what we choose to build," and his breath carried hope. Michael said, "I cannot undo my part, but I can witness yours," and his hands trembled with fragile relief. The narrator said daylight pressed in, washing faces pale but clear, as though the storm had written its last chapter. The narrator said outside the courthouse, whispers grew into ripples of truth across the town. Ava said, "They will know now," and her voice steadied. Lena said, "They already do," and her glance swept the gathering faces. Ethan said, "No headline can twist what they saw," and pride lifted his chin. Michael said, "Forgiveness may not come, but clarity already has," and sorrow bent his tone. The narrator said the air shifted, carrying a sense of release as the crowd lingered. Ava said, "This is the first morning in years that feels like a beginning," and her smile carried quiet steel. The narrator said the house on the bluff felt different when they returned, its silence no longer a cage but a witness. Ava said, "The walls don't lie, only the people within," and her hand brushed the banister. Lena said, Then let the house keep its stories. And she closed a ledger gently. Ethan said, maybe we painted bright for once, and Hope teased his grin. Michael said, I will leave the past here and walk lighter, and his voice carried release. The narrator said the ocean outside roared softer, its rhythm no longer a threat but a song. The narrator said, new beginnings are born fragile, stitched from ash and resolve. Ava said, we carry forward what matters, and her eyes held fire tempered by peace. Lena said, truth is weight, but also foundation, and her voice steadied. Ethan said, even broken families can build something honest, and his laugh rose lighter. Michael said, I may never rebuild trust, but I will walk with you, and his words trembled with sincerity. The narrator said the horizon opened wide, no longer hidden by storm clouds, but painted with fragile light waiting to grow. The narrator said endings linger when silence speaks louder than words. Ava said, we are not what he made us, but what we chose to become, and her voice etched finality. Victor stood alone in the distance, no longer powerful but hollow. Lena said, the truth freed us, and her tone held both grief and pride. Ethan said, then let the lies stay buried, and his voice calmed. Michael said, may tomorrow be gentler, and his eyes closed. The narrator said the house, the sea and the sky all joined in stillness, sealing a chapter and opening another.